Welcome to the very first episode of Perspectives with Asima Silva. Before we get to our host, Asima, and our guest who is going to be joining us today to talk about gun violence, just wanted to have Asima set up a little bit about how this program came to be. Sadly, there have been a number of events in our country that have led to a national discussion. Part of that discussion, Asima, really seems to center on religion, on gender, and on were people speaking up. And that's where you and I first met a couple of years ago, and you came forward and said, I think there's some real misconceptions out there. Right. Muslim women are strong, Muslim women are not silent, and you put together this program, Perspectives, to make sure that that perspective and your voice was being heard.
Exactly. I think there was a need for us to have a voice. There was a need for minorities to say their stories. We always notice only one side of the story being told on mainstream media, and I really wanted an avenue to have all the stories being told, giving different perspectives, allowing people to make up their own mind with all the information possible on a topic, which brings us to today's show, which is about gun violence. And we have a guest today, Dr. Amjad Bahnassi, who is a local psychiatrist in the Shrewsbury area, to talk about gun violence and how it affects us psychologically. So thank you for joining us today, Doctor.
Yeah, it's so sad. I mean, this coming, of course, on the heels of what just happened in Las Vegas, and unfortunately not the first time that we have dealt with gun violence here in the United States. We go back to Columbine. We go back to some of the other mass shootings that we have had, including Sandy Hook, which just so shocked the nation.
Yeah, that was with children. Unfortunately, it seems like every other week we hear drastic, violent, extremist behavior that destroys people's lives, and the country is weeping. But we want to talk about how does this affect us as a community? How do we see this? And after a while, a lot of people say, yeah, well, a week later we forget about the tragedy that happened the time before. And we shouldn't be forgetting. Every life that was lost is just as valuable as any other life, regardless if it was 2 weeks ago or last week or, God forbid, in the future. But how do we as a community not stop feeling?
Well, this one happened in a very difficult time. If you remember, the month of September was a very difficult month to start with. We were hit with hurricanes, huge amount of rain fell in Houston, over 50 inches. We were hit with problems with hurricanes in Florida, with what happened in Puerto Rico, and with what happened also earthquake in Mexico. So we were hit with multiple national disasters and international disasters. And to add to all of that, we were hit with this huge problem and huge incident in Las Vegas, where we're still scratching our heads and we don't know what happened exactly and how it happened and who's at fault. We're going to learn a lot from it. I'm sure we're going to talk about it later also in more details, but as a nation, we've been, like you said, weeping. It's been very difficult few weeks for us to be faced with such situation has been very hurtful to us. When we hear someone from us, not stranger, who opens fire without we know what's the reason, it hurts us. And like you said, we don't know what's going on. What's the answer? What happened? That makes it more difficult, actually, because even the previous incidents, there were cause, there was a reason why it happened, whether it's clearly not the right reason, but at least people in their mind felt that was a reason. But here, we still don't know what happened. It left us with hurt, guilt, sad, sorrow, anger, and questions, what can we do with deal with this anger?
And as you said, I mean, here we have a millionaire, so there wouldn't be any kind of an obvious reason. There's no note left behind. All the people around him are saying, boy, we had no idea, although we've heard that in the past as well. So, you made such a great point about the time. I mean, this has, here we've had a week, And yet, it seems, in some ways, Doctor, as if the nation has already moved on. So on the one hand, we don't have these answers, so maybe we haven't been able to come to grips, grieve. Everybody kind of immediately got into their two camps. It became about gun control, yes or no for gun control. But now we're talking about the Iran deal. Now we're talking about Obamacare. We're talking about, you know, these political matters. And Las Vegas in a very short period of time, or Puerto Rico in a very short period of time. Suddenly, they happened such a short time ago. They seem like they could have happened forever ago because the nightly news now is on to whatever the next story is. Does that affect us? Do we not have enough, because things move so fast in this day and age, do we not have enough time to kind of sort through it without our even realizing it? We haven't processed some of this.
It's not just process, right? Time to grieve. We haven't had time as a community to grieve.
Exactly. That's exactly what's happening. And that's why I said multiple events happened, made us just trying to protect ourselves from someone hitting us right and left, and we're just trying to put our hands and protect ourselves. But in the meanwhile, it's hurting us. It's a very painful situation to all of us, and it's a very sad situation. And we need time to grieve. The most important thing after every trauma is to process the trauma. And it doesn't look like we have enough time to process the trauma. Unfortunately, the fast pace of politics sometimes dictates that. So like you just said, we move from one incident to another, and as if we all already forgot about the previous one. And that's why the public is looking for answers. Before we move to another incident, we need to address this one and also come up with some answers to it.
So your recommendation psychologically is to talk about gun control at this moment, because that is something that is being discussed in the media. This is not the right time to talk about gun violence and gun control. But you're saying psychologically as a community and as us moving forward, we do need to talk about this topic.
I think it's very important that we do, because most of us feel there is a need for resolution. If we don't discuss this, try to at least start the debate about it. We may not agree on it, and that's perfectly fine, and that's actually healthy for us. But at the end of the day, we need to process it, and nothing wrong with talking about gun control.
Yeah, I would say that in this case, when it comes to gun control, a little bit of a difference in that it seems as if both sides, the right and the left, and again, I think, you know, immediately everybody goes and kind of goes to their default position. But in this case, I think everybody has agreed that the shooter's ability to be able to turn a weapon into really an automatic weapon and be able to fire that many rounds in that short period of time to do that kind of damage, that anything that allows him to do that should be outlawed, that is not something that people need. So we may actually have at least one thing that the right and the left can agree upon. I don't know, and I'm looking for your opinion as to, is that a starting point? Does that help us maybe get more of a conversation going?
Well, what I learned that in negotiations, when you are at impasse and you don't know how to approach the issue, what you do initially is put the points that you agree on. And then you can delay the points and discuss it, the ones you don't agree on. But exactly like you said, it looks like we have some common ground right now that we can start the process. At least there is something we can talk about. Nevertheless, I'm sure neither party at the end we're going to feel that it's not enough or it's too much, and they're going to start debating. One of the problems here that we're being polarized for the most part here, unfortunately. And that's a problem also. We are either right or left. Although, believe it or not, the vast majority of us are neither on the right nor on the left. Most of us are in the middle. But our voice is not heard, unfortunately.
There's another part to this, too. There hasn't only been the gun control debate, but I have also heard where there are those who want this to be labeled as a terrorist act. And the whole definition then of what is a terrorist act, what is not a terrorist act, kind of, I think, goes along with this conversation in the nation of what is a hate crime, what is not a hate crime, can only certain groups be involved in a terrorist act, can only certain groups, perform a hate crime. And I think that conversation was there for a moment. I don't hear it much, except in those first couple of days, that there were people who were absolutely unhappy that it was not labeled an act of terrorism. Because
not only are we as a community grieving, but there's certain parts of the community that also are grieving, but also feeling slighted or neglected, because if it was one of their people, it would have been labeled a different label, like a terrorist. And they're looking at the same action. You replace a couple of the nouns and it would have been called something different. So that brings me to the question that you were, I think, maybe alluding to, is we're bombarded with so many issues. Mental health issues, gun violence, natural disasters. How do we compartmentalize? How do we talk about each one individually? Do we sit down and talk about all of them at the same time? Just like what you said with the gun control, with the Las Vegas incident, if it was not a white male, if it was somebody else, that might have been a person of color or a LGBT or anybody else, any minority, psychologically, what would happen? I mean, the media would have blamed it on that entire community. That's what we have seen in the past. But how are we supposed to handle the people who are upset and grieving in both ways when it comes to that?
I think this should be a good start, because the lack of motive of the perpetrator makes it a good starting point that not all of the violent actions are terrorist acts. So here's one that's not terrorist act. So maybe that both parties now can agree and say, move the terrorist issue away. It's another issue here that needs to be addressed. Now, it doesn't mean we should not address terrorism. We need to address terrorism because our safety depends on it. But it appears that there is other issues beside that needs to be addressed, including mental health, including gun control, including regular health. We know what happened now with the lack of ability to change Obama's care, that there's going to be cut in the funding, there's going to be changes in the health in general. So how are we going to handle that? And that we need to talk about that.
I do, though, to drill down a little bit more on this, because I think you bring up an interesting point. So we have, on the one hand, we should be talking about this, as you have said. But I do feel, there was a part of me that when immediately it started to be about gun control, I said, can we take some time to think about the victims, their poor families, what they are going through? Do I immediately have to get back into the politics of it, the political discussion? Am I somehow doing a disservice, or am I forgetting the actual victims of the largest mass shooting in America, and I'm not giving them their due? In my rush to be on one side or the other, I'm not even finding out the personal stories of these people who were killed or injured.
I think it's a fair question and fair points to raise, that we want to delay the debate until we grieve a little bit. Nothing wrong with that. But the fear from one party is that we're not trying to delay the debate, we're trying to put it under the table, and we don't want to talk about it. If there was a sincere effort on every party that no problem, let's grieve now, give it a month, and then let's schedule something in a month from now to start the debate, I think everyone will be okay with that. Unfortunately, things happen fast. We just learned that the Mandalay Bay is being sued by the attorneys. So they didn't wait for time to grieve. They just immediately went and started the process. We tend to do things fast, but nothing wrong with saying, no problem, let's give it a few more weeks now, and but let's set up a date for debate so we don't feel it's brushed off under the carpet.
Are different people going through different things? Boy, if I'm the performer, am I going through one thing? If I'm somebody who was, obviously lost a family member, I heard this heartbreaking story. My goodness, the father, his daughter is in Vegas on this trip, and and I'm sure this is a story that was repeated over and over, but he gets a picture of her, a selfie of her, at that concert. Dad having a wonderful time, snap, here I am with all these thousands of people. And then an hour later, he's watching on the news, and then later, of course, he gets the news that his daughter is one of those victims. I can't even imagine, right? And then there's us, right? What we've been talking about. There's America, and how does all of this violence kind of affect us, and do we, is there maybe even a little bit of a national depression that we don't even know is affecting us? Are these all separate groups? Does it all kind of play into one thing? If you're immediately affected, do you tend to grieve one way? If you're us and we feel horrible, but we didn't know somebody who was there, and I'm not, you know, a performer getting back up on stage.
Right.
I don't know. Do you worry the next time you go on stage that there's some madman who's
that's
getting
what
ready to
I was
open
gonna
up?
say too. Is we were talking about community moving on, but what was your recommendation for individuals who are directly affected, who are also watching? So how is that different from how a community would grieve or move on forward?
The closer you are to the incident, the more you're going to be involved, the more you're going to be grieving, and the more you're going to need help. So the closer you are, the more you're going to need some help. Us, for outsider, I think we should talk about it. I think we should talk about it in our dinner table. We should talk about it with our families. We should talk to our teenagers. Talk about, is it safe for you again to go to a concert like that? If you want to go to a concert, what kind of safety we can reassure you? What kind of safety the community can reassure you also? How do you feel about what happened? Do you want to respond to people who want to hijack your freedom? Or do you really want to move forward and do things that they didn't want you to do in the first place? And all of these things should be debated, but the best thing is to start talking about it within ourselves.
Right.
How do we start that dialogue, maybe? And now I'm thinking about younger people who are exposed to this. You can't get away from it. I mean, it used to be you had 3 TV networks, everybody sat down at 6 o'clock and watched, or you didn't. You know, I mean, mom and dad really had a lot more control, I think, over what you were able to see and be exposed to. Now, I mean, the kids, it's in their Twitter feed, it's on Facebook, all over social media. How do you begin that dialogue, particularly with our family members who may not be processing it, or not the way that an adult would?
Yeah, it's really a challenge, and not all families are sophisticated enough to start that, sophisticated dialogue also within themselves. And some, families just hardly can find time to sit at the table together and be able to have a meal with each other. Again, the response is going to be different from one family to another, depending on the sophistication of the core of the family and how close they are with each other. But if you are a family member and you don't feel like you're getting what you need from your family, I think the family should seek outside help. And it is available. There's a lot of psychologists, psychotherapists who are available who can help talking about that. Most schools have school counselors, and they also can help. Believe it or not, even your pediatrician, even your primary care doctor, you can talk to them about. They're trained. They do have some training, and they will help you process this too.
Asma, you personally, because on your radio show, you have talked about this. There have been times when there has been violence in the United States. There have been terrorist attacks upon the United States, carried out by ISIS, by these fanatics, and you have gone out to the grocery store, or you have gone to the gas station. And simply because of your looks, people have, in the immediate aftermath of that, people have looked at you differently.
Right.
In this case, that would not have happened. I mean, did you feel that at all?
That's definitely something I think a lot of people felt. I felt that way because after the San Bernardino attack, I felt they looked too much like me. So I was a little hesitant when I was going outside. They were Pakistani, so of course they had darker skin and darker hair. So it does make you feel a little on edge. This, as much of a tragic as it was, I felt like at least I wasn't under the microscope and I wasn't under scrutiny, which I think a lot of people might have felt. I don't think I was alone in feeling that way. But in terms of, we were talking about how people can move forward. What would you?
Can I comment on
yes,
this
yes,
issue?
please.
Unfortunately, we tend to stereotype, all of us, regardless. We're guilty of it too. Even the minorities, we're guilty of that. If you remember, initially, right after Las Vegas incident, Fox News announced that, well, since the country music lovers were targeted, that means there were likelihood to be Trump lovers also, and that's why they were targeted. So we tend to stereotype and sometimes point fingers. And actually that hurts us a lot. Why does it hurt us? Because sometimes we alienate groups that we need them to help us in this process. For instance, we need the majority of the Muslims in this country are law-abiding, they love their country, And if we alienate them, we're hurting ourselves and our cause. While actually, if we include them and we say, you are not the problem, you are part of the solution, and let's isolate the bad ones and let's get rid of them and you help us with do that, I think that all of us will be in better shape.
Right. And I think that goes across the board with
Yes.
children too, right? I mean, even in schools and bullying
Right.
and whatnot.
Absolutely.
But in terms of going back to trauma, and you were talking about how families directly were affected, what do the family members or people that know, because I believe there's a couple of local people who are also very much affected.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
What can we do for them and what can they do to heal and grieve?
Right. Well, I think those close, I think it was Sharon Mass or something
Yes.
like that, that the family was. They really clearly they need to get help, to professional help to deal with their feelings, to deal with their emotions, to talk about PTSD, talk about the symptoms, if they have the symptoms of PTSD or not, and grieve. They should grieve and they should feel sad, and that's perfectly fine and perfectly healthy.
Well, we don't have too much time on this. I know that could be a whole different show, but could you briefly tell us what PTSD is? Because it's a word that, or acronym that is so overused. Not all of us quite understand what that is.
Yeah, it's post-traumatic stress disorder. That if you witnessed or you were involved in trauma, or even if you're treating trauma, or even if you're watching trauma on TV, sometimes you go through some symptoms which are very unpleasant. You can get flashbacks, nightmares, depression, anxiety, hyperarousal, irritability, anger, agitation, remembering the incident again, re-experiencing the incident, and that can last for some time. And there is some pharmacological treatment. There is at least 2 FDA medications approved for that, and those are Paxil and Zoloft. But there is also psychotherapy, and there's multiple therapy techniques they deal with this issue. So it can linger, it can be very painful, and can affect people's life. It can really affect the quality of many people.
Yeah, you made that comment about community as well. With Puerto Rico, which you mentioned in the beginning, I mean, we just were hit with one thing after another, now culminating with this mass shooting. With Puerto Rico, because here in Worcester we have so many people who were born, still have in Puerto Rico, now live in Worcester, family members in that they still have back in Puerto Rico, the community itself, even people who don't have any direct ties to Puerto Rico, came together, raised the Puerto Rican flag over City Hall as a sign of solidarity, have done things to say, hey, we're with you, drives, food drives, local churches, everything else. For these families that you're talking about, because there's only a few of them, they don't have, there isn't that same sort of outpouring of community. They may have their church community or they may have other communities, but there doesn't seem, is that important? I mean, the fact that a whole community, the way that it did for Puerto Rico, will kind of come together and say, hey, we're here for you, we understand that something horrible has happened.
Yeah, clearly far more involved people in Puerto Rico than it is in Las Vegas, although Las Vegas was 58 people, the deceased, and about 500-600 the injured one. But Puerto Rico, the whole island was removed, actually. They said, for many years they're going to have difficulties rebuilding. Doesn't make the pain less.
Right.
The pain's still the same. We still hurt. And I think we should have enough feelings towards both incidents.
Does it help? I mean, there were a lot of people, and I thought there wasn't, it was kind of a fair point on social media. People, of course, hear about the mass shooting in Puerto Rico or whatever, and you just type in on your Facebook page, thoughts and prayers. And there were a lot of people who this time around I saw after this mass shooting said, you know what, enough of the thoughts and prayers. Now, they didn't honestly mean don't think about them or don't pray for them. What they meant was enough about you get off the hook as a society by writing on Facebook, hey, thoughts and prayers. Oh, okay, I've done my bit for this mass shooting in Las Vegas. Now I can go about my life. What are we really going to do about it? How are we really going to drill down? So as a community, do we need to do more?
Yes, absolutely, we need to do more. Thoughts and prayers, wonderful thing. Spirituality is extremely important in the treatment of PTSD. We do rely on it, but we need resolution. People also need to feel that their anger, their sadness, depression should be channeled in the proper way, especially if it gets channeled in the wrong way, and that's when we have problems. And that's where we hear sometimes about people going out of control and having problems because their anger is not channeled properly. So we need to channel our energy, anger, in the proper way, in the healthy way, and that's why we start the debate talking about these things.
Well, I feel like there's a lot of that going on in the
Yeah.
U.S. right now over
Yeah.
a whole host of things, that there's a lot of people who they're holding a lot inside, and one day
is.
it's just going to explode.
Right.
That's why we have to channel that. They have to feel they're contributing. So when you start the debate and start talking about it in a healthy way,
Right.
that's what this nation needs. Healthy debate, not emotional, not fighting, not polarizing, but us coming together. And leadership can provide that to us if we have the right leadership. I will never forget when President Bush at 9/11, when he was talking to them through the loudspeaker, and he said, "Do you hear me?" And they said, "No." He said, "But I can hear you." That gesture touched everyone, made everyone, whether you like Bush or you don't, but you felt that this president is there for us at that moment, at least. He is there to help us.
Yeah,
Right.
boy,
That's
great
very
point.
powerful.
It really,
That's
it did
extremely
it really
powerful.
galvanized the country.
Yeah.
It really brought people together. Common cause. That is a great point. Boy, I know, Asma, that we only have a couple of minutes left in this, the first show here for Perspectives with Asma Silva. As always, what we like to do at the end with that last couple of minutes or so is get your perspective on the issues that we have been talking about.
Well, first of all, before I get into that, I'd like to thank Dr. Bahnassi for coming, and I'm sure I will have you again many more times because there's many, many different topics I'd like to go over, especially considering mental health. On the topic today of gun violence, with our discussion, what we have learned is, as a community and as a country, we are grieving, and we hear a lot of incidents that are happening over and over again, be it natural disaster, be it because of a terrorist attack, be it because of other political reasons, whatever they may be. We all need to take time to grieve. We all need to take time to talk about it. We all need to take time to actually support the people who are directly involved, directly affected. But as a community, I think if we work together, we will all become a better community and a better America.
Yeah.
But
well said.
it's a great show, and I look forward to doing more. And thank you, Hank, and Hank is my co-host, and thank you for being my co-host. And
Happy to be here because, again, as we do have maybe just a minute or so left, maybe we will circle back just to a little bit about the purpose of this show. I was very struck a few years ago, as some people will know, I did morning radio here in Worcester for 20 years. A lot of callers would call up, and one of the things that we would often hear was, geez, I don't hear the Muslim voice. Something would happen, and people would call up and say, I don't hear the Muslim voice. And you heard those same things. So when you said, hey, and through your organizations, hey, you know, I mean, I'm thinking of a radio program. Do you think it would fly? I said, boy, not only do I think it would fly, and now this TV program, but I think it's important. I think it's important to have this perspective and for people to see that everybody is their perception of people being silent is perhaps not what's actually happening in the community.
right, even though I was hesitant to start it, I figured it was my way of showing that Muslim women do have a voice. We are not hiding behind a curtain. Muslim women, especially in America, are very well-to-do, educated, and outgoing. And I hope to prove that to you with this show.
Does bring us to the end of our first episode. Thank you.